I used to whistle all the time. In the car, on trail, while I was making coffee in the morning, while I was grading papers at night, while I was lacing my boots, or checking gear, or just walking from one room to another for no particular reason. It was never intentional. That's the thing I want you to understand first. Whistling wasn't something I decided to do. It was something my body did on its own. The way other people tap their fingers or click a pen. It was just part of how I moved through the world. I haven't done it in 14 months. Not once. Not a fragment. Not even the shape of it, that particular tension in the lips, that directed breath. I catch myself about to, sometimes. The reflex is still there. The same way you can still feel a tooth that's been pulled. The impulse fires, and then something else fires right after it, and I stop. Every time, without thinking, without deciding. I want to be clear. I'm not being dramatic. I'm not telling you this to make you lean forward. I'm telling you this because it's the most accurate description I can give of what happened at Kephart Prong, what it cost me, and what it cost other people, and what it is still doing right now, whether I understand it or not. Something in that drainage changed the way I hear silence. To explain what I mean, I need to tell you about the posting, and why I wanted it, and what I knew going in, which was almost nothing. I was a music teacher for 6 years, middle school, then high school. I was good at it, I think. I knew how to make kids care about something they'd been told wasn't for them. I knew how to make a room feel safe enough for someone to try something difficult in front of other people. That's most of what teaching actually is: safety management, creating the conditions where failure doesn't feel fatal. I wasn't good enough at it to keep Marcus Ellard alive. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It was a field trip, a nature walk through a state forest in late April. Permission slip signed, itinerary filed, everything by the procedure. He was 12. He wandered off the marked trail during a rest stop and fell down a ravine embankment. He was unconscious when we found him, and he didn't wake up. He was the one who always hummed in class, quietly, to himself, while he worked. Little melodic fragments, nothing in particular, just sound filling the space around him. I left teaching 8 months after he died. I retrained, wilderness first aid, land navigation, NPS seasonal certification. I wanted a job where the primary hazard was weather and terrain, not the gap between what you planned and what happened to a child in your care. I requested the most remote posting available for the fall shoulder season. They gave me Kephart Prong. I didn't know what that meant yet. I arrived on a Thursday in late October. The drive-in from the Okonalufte Visitor Center took 40 minutes on roads that got progressively less interested in accommodating a vehicle, and the last half mile was on foot with a pack, down a trail that smelled like wet hemlock and creek mud, and the particular cold that settles into a north-facing drainage when the sun drops behind the ridge. The station appeared through the trees, the way old stone buildings appear gradually, like it had been there so long it had started growing. CCC construction, Depression era, the kind of work done by people who understood that structures in remote places had to outlast the people who built them. The walls were solid. The roof had been replaced more recently. There was a wood pile stacked neatly along the east wall, and a water quality monitoring kit in a weatherproof case on the porch, and a woman standing in the doorway, watching me come up the trail. Her name was Inez Varga. She was in her mid-40s, compact and efficient-looking, with the kind of stillness that develops in people who spend extended time in places where making unnecessary movement is a habit you train out of yourself. She had been assigned to Kephart Prong for 2 seasons. She didn't say hello. The first thing she did was look at my mouth. Not my face, not my eyes, my mouth. A quick, assessing look, the kind a doctor gives a specific symptom. Then she stepped back and let me in and started walking me through the logistics water monitoring schedule, campsite verification routes, radio check-in times with Okonalufti dispatch, supply inventory, blowdown reporting protocol. When I asked what she had been checking for, she said, "Posture." I didn't believe her. She showed me the bunk room, the supply locker, the radio setup on the narrow shelf beside the east window, a standard NPS handheld unit in a charging cradle, plus a backup. She showed me where the water monitoring forms were kept, and where the trail condition reports went, and where the first aid kit was mounted on the wall above the kitchen counter. Then she showed me the inside of the front door, taped at eye level, with the kind of deliberate placement that means someone wanted it seen every single time the door was used, was a laminated card, standard white cardstock, laminated in the clear plastic sleeves the district office uses for trail signage. The text was in the same font the NPS uses on official forms. But there was no form number in the corner, no issuing authority, no date, no signature. Nothing that would let you trace it back to anyone. 7 rules, all of them about sound. I read them twice, slowly, the way I used to read a new piece of music before I tried to play it, looking for the logic underneath before committing to interpretation. Do not whistle after 1900 hours. This includes humming, tonal vocalizations, or melodic breathing patterns. If you hear a melody from outside the station, do not identify it. Do not name it. Do not recognize it aloud or in writing. Do not complete a melody you did not begin. If you began one, do not stop it. Finish it completely before going silent. If the creek goes quiet, do not make any sound for 15 minutes. Set a timer. Do not count aloud. Do not whistle in response to another person's whistle until you have visually confirmed that person is human and facing toward you. If you must communicate after 1900 hours, use only spoken words. No tonal variation. No rising inflection. Flat effect only. If you hear your own voice whistling from outside the station, do not answer it. Do not approach the window. Write your name on paper and place it face down on the floor. I asked Inez who wrote them. She said she didn't know. I asked if they were enforced. She said that was the wrong question. I asked what the right question was. She went to the kitchen and started boiling water and didn't answer. I memorized the rules before I unpacked my gear. Force of habit from 6 years of teaching. If there's a list, you commit it to memory before you need it. At the time, I framed it as professional instinct. I understand now it was something closer to the body recognizing danger before the mind catches up. The first night was quiet. The creek ran steadily outside, a constant, low, white noise that filled the drainage corridor and made the station feel less isolated than it was. I followed the rules less out of fear than out of the same professionalism that made me memorize them. After 7 p.m., I spoke only when necessary. I kept my voice level. I did not whistle. Twice I almost did. The first time was at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes. My lips formed the shape before I caught at a fragment of something. Nothing in particular, just sound looking for a way out. I stopped. The second time was just before I fell asleep, lying in the bunk in the dark, and I felt the breath shaping itself in my chest, that particular compression, and I redirected it into a slow exhale. Both times it felt strange to stop, not difficult, just strange, like interrupting a sentence in the middle of a word. I slept well that first night. I want to note that specifically because I want you to understand what the contrast felt like later. I wouldn't sleep well again. The second day was a Tuesday, and it was beautiful in the way that late October in the Smokies is beautiful when the weather holds stripped canopy, letting slant light through. The trail surface covered in a wet layer of yellow and rust-colored leaves. The creek running clear over the smooth stones in the prong bed. The air smelled like cold water and decaying bark, and something sharper underneath, the mineral smell that comes off wet quartzite after a night of temperature drop. I ran the water monitoring circuit first thing. 3 gauge stations along the prong, each requiring a manual reading and a recorded entry on the waterproof field form. The readings were normal. The creek ran at expected seasonal levels. I noted the water temperature, the clarity, the absence of any visible erosion events from the recent wind. Then I pulled the permit verification route, 2 miles up drainage to the designated backcountry campsite, checking for occupants and confirming valid permit numbers against the district register. The site was empty. The fire ring was cold and clean. Someone had packed out their trash properly, which I noted in the trail log because it was worth noting. By the time I was heading back down to the station, I had covered nearly 5 miles of trail and documented 12 separate data points. The work was good, specific, physical, bounded by procedure. It required attention without requiring emotional exposure. It suited me in the way that I needed something to suit me. I started to wonder, somewhere around mile 4, whether I had overreacted to the card on the door. Whether 7 strange rules were really so different from any other set of strange institutional protocols that accumulate in remote outposts over decades. I was very comfortable. That was the problem. I hummed on the way back. I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters. It wasn't a melody I chose. It was one of those folk fragments that surfaces in the back of the mind without invitation, something I'd used in class once. A simple Appalachian modal tune in a minor key. The kind of melody that was written to be easy to remember, and therefore almost impossible to forget. I wasn't performing it. I wasn't even really aware of it until I'd been doing it for probably 30 seconds. It was 4:20 in the afternoon, not after 7 p.m. The rules said nothing about daytime. I let it continue for a few bars. The trail was empty. The light was still good. The creek ran alongside me to my left, and the hemlocks made their quiet ceiling overhead. And everything was exactly as a forest is supposed to be. Then, from the east-facing slope above the trail, perhaps 40 yards uphill through the trees, I heard 3 notes back. Not an echo. Echoes replicate the source interval. This was a different interval, the next logical measure of the phrase I'd been humming, not a copy of the one before it. Like something had heard the general direction of my melody and attempted to predict what came next. I stopped walking. The 3 notes did not repeat. I stood on the trail for a full minute, listening to the creek and the wind in the stripped branches, and nothing else. Then I took out my field notebook and wrote, "Possible bird call, east slope, unidentified species, musical pattern, 16-20 hours." I knew it wasn't a bird. I knew it the way you know the difference between an echo and a response. I didn't tell Inez about the 3 notes. I'm not entirely sure why. Part of it was professional. I'd written it up as an unidentified bird call, and reporting it verbally would have required me to contradict my own field notation, which felt like an admission of something I wasn't ready to admit. Part of it was something less rational. I'd been at Kephart Prong for less than 48 hours. Inez had been here 2 seasons. Whatever she knew about that slope and that drainage, she had chosen not to volunteer it. I decided to watch rather than ask. On the 3rd evening, over dinner, I tried a different angle. I asked her about her previous rotation at Kephart Prong. Not about the card, not about the rules, just about the season, how it had gone, what conditions were like, whether the trail had been rerouted yet. She answered carefully. Too carefully, in the way that careful answers are sometimes more revealing than careless ones. She described an uneventful rotation. Good weather through most of October. Some blowdown in early November. Steady water readings throughout. I asked about her previous partner. A pause. Not a long pause. She was too controlled for a long pause, but a pause with weight in it. She said he had been reassigned. Different district, end of season. She said it neutrally, the way you say something you've decided on the phrasing of in advance. That night, after she'd gone to her bunk, I pulled the station maintenance log from the shelf, a thick binder going back to 2009. I found the previous ranger's entries without difficulty. His name was written in a clean, upright hand. His notes were thorough and professional all the way through October of the prior year. They stopped on a Tuesday in November, not at the end of a page, not at the end of a week. In the middle of a sentence, mid-word almost, and then nothing. The next entry was in Inez's handwriting. There was no transfer note, no final day summary, no indication of reassignment. Just a Tuesday, and then Inez. I put the log back exactly where I found it. Same shelf position, same angle, the spine flush with the edge. I didn't confront Inez about the missing transition. I needed her operational. Whatever she knew, she was still here, and the previous ranger wasn't. That differential told me something important about the specific value of her particular kind of knowledge, even if that knowledge was being delivered in the form of deliberate omissions. I was almost at my bunk door when she spoke from the dark. "You hum," she said. "You probably don't know how much." I stopped. I know, I said. You need to stop before the sun goes down, not at 7. Before. She said it the way you say something you've said before and watched not be believed. Flat. Preemptively resigned to the response. The card says 7, I said. The card is a compromise. I turned around. She was lying on her bunk with one arm over her eyes, not looking at me. Between who? I asked. Between what could be written down and what couldn't. I waited for more. There wasn't more. She pulled her arm down and turned toward the wall, and that was the end of it. I lay awake for a long time after that. Not because I was afraid, exactly, but because I was recalibrating. The rules on the laminated card had felt arbitrary before specific, yes, and strange, but the kind of strange that accumulates in institutional settings over time without anyone fully knowing why. Now they felt like something different. They felt like a translation of something that didn't have a natural language. I stopped watching the clock after that. I started watching the light. The fourth night, I was sitting at the station table, filling out trail condition reports. It was 6:47 p.m. by my watch. The wood stove had been going for 2 hours, and the station was warm in the specific way that old stone buildings get warm, slow and thorough. The heat coming from the walls as much as from the fire. My pen moved down the form. Blowdown count, trail surface condition, drainage crossings, permit compliance. I was exhaling through my teeth. I didn't realize it at first. It was the melodic breathing pattern that Rule 1 specifically prohibited, not a whistle, not a hum, but the breath shaping itself into a tonal line on the way out. The kind of thing I had done unconsciously at my classroom desk for years while grading papers. Quiet, rhythmic. Nothing anyone would call music, but nothing that could be called random either. The rule said after 7 p.m., it was 6:47. Inez had said before the sun goes down. The sun had been down for 40 minutes. From the hemlock line, approximately 40 feet from the station's east wall, something answered. Not 3 notes this time. A full measure, the complete next phrase of the melodic line my breath had been tracing. Finished cleanly, correctly. The right interval, the right resolution, the exact next step of something I hadn't even known I was saying. I put my pen down. I did not move. The station was warm and well lit, and solid stone, and none of that mattered in the slightest. What mattered was the specific quality of what I had just heard, not an approximation, not a near miss, but a completion. Something outside had heard the shape of my exhalation and produced the next measure without a gap, without hesitation, the way a musician finishes a phrase that another musician starts. It knew what came next. It had known what came next before I did. I sat at that table, and I did not move, and I did not make any sound at all. It was only when the initial shock passed, when my body stopped running the particular physiological sequence that follows genuine fright and settled back into something closer to function, that I noticed the creek had gone silent. I don't know when it stopped. I had been focused on the forms, and the creek's sound had been so constant since I arrived that my brain had filed it under background, the kind of sound you stop hearing because it's always there. Sometime in the last few minutes, while I was exhaling in melodic patterns, and something outside was completing them, The creak had simply stopped. I set my phone timer for 15 minutes. Rule 4. Creak goes quiet. Do not make any sound. 15 minutes. Do not count aloud. I set the timer without making a sound, and I placed the phone face up on the table where I could see the countdown, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I breathed through my nose in the most neutral, atonal pattern I could produce. At minute 11, the radio on the shelf beside the east window emitted a burst of static. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was not words, but it was not purely random either. There was a rhythmic quality to it, a pattern of gaps and pulses that my musician's ear organized involuntarily into something that resembled a melodic fragment. I recognized the shape of it the way you recognize a word in a language you don't speak, not the meaning, but the structure. I did not respond. At minute 15, the timer vibrated silently in my hand. 30 seconds later, the creak came back. The same volume, the same frequency, the same constant voice it had always had. I opened my field notebook and wrote, "Creak silence duration, estimated 22 minutes. Personal awareness, approximately 15 minutes. Timer held. No response to radio static." Then I closed the notebook and sat in the warm station and waited for morning. I told Inez the next morning. Not everything I didn't mention the melodic breathing, the specific way the thing outside had completed my phrase. I described it as unusual audio from the east slope and a period of creak silence with anomalous radio behavior, ranger language, incident report language, the kind of framing that lets you describe the impossible in terms that sound like they belong in a form. She listened without asking questions. When I was done, she nodded a single nod, the kind that isn't agreement, but acknowledgement, the kind that means I already assumed this would happen. Then she said, "Don't write that in the official log." I asked why. She said, "Because the official log gets reviewed." I waited for her to continue. She didn't. That night, 5 we were both inside after 7 p.m., working separately in the main room. Inez was updating the water monitoring records at the table. I was reading at the other end of the bench. The wood stove was burning low. Outside, the creek ran normally, and the wind moved through the hemlocks in the way it always did. And for a while, everything was simply what it appeared to be. Then, from somewhere beyond the east wall, a melody drifted in. Slow, repetitive, the notes coming spaced enough apart that the ear worked to connect them the particular pacing of something that understands that a melody needs to be almost recognized before it becomes dangerous. It was almost a song. It was almost something I could have named. Inez went very still across the table. I watched her face. I watched the specific process of someone fighting a recognition reflex, the slight tension at the corners of the eyes, the almost imperceptible parting of the lips. She lost. Under her breath, so quietly I almost missed it, she named it. An old mountain song, 3 syllables, a title, a real song from this region, the kind that had been sung in these hollows for 150 years. The moment the name left her mouth, the melody outside shifted. It became more complex, more specific, more hers. Inez did not speak again that night. She finished her water monitoring records with mechanical precision and went to her bunk at exactly 9 p.m. and lay there in the dark. And I don't know if she slept. I know I didn't. What I knew, what I had now seen with my own eyes, was that naming the melody had changed something. The sound outside had responded to recognition, the way a flame responds to oxygen. It had grown. It had individuated. Whatever had been drifting and general before she named it had become, afterward, pointed and specific, and hers in some way that I couldn't define but couldn't misread. Rule 2 was not a bureaucratic quirk. It was the description of a mechanism. I lay in my bunk and thought about Inez's previous partner, whose entries stopped mid-sentence on a Tuesday in November. And I thought about what Inez had said about the card being a compromise between what could be written down and what couldn't. And I thought about the fact that she had survived 2 seasons and still made the mistake of naming the melody. If she could make that mistake, I could make any mistake. The next morning, a day hiker came down the access trail, a young man, early 20s, day pack, trail runners, the look of someone who had underestimated the distance and was mildly embarrassed about it. He had come from the upper trail junction. He'd seen something that concerned him, he said, a woman, alone, sitting on a rock in the creek bed about a mile up from the station. Just sitting there, rocking slightly, making a sound he couldn't quite describe. Not crying, he said, more like humming. He couldn't get her attention. My training activated before I could think about the rules. A person, alone, unresponsive, in a remote drainage, possible medical event, possible psychological crisis. A welfare check was not optional. It was protocol. It was my job. It was the entire reason the position existed. I radioed Okanalufte dispatch. I kept my voice completely flat. No inflection. No rise at the end of the sentence. Pure information delivery, per Rule 6. The rule I now understood was not about professionalism, but about acoustic invisibility. I described the situation in the exact language that language was designed for. Dispatch told me to investigate and confirm. I looked at the door, and the laminated card, and the rule about visual confirmation of another person before responding to their signal. And I thought about a woman sitting on a rock in the creek bed, rocking, humming, unresponsive. Then I picked up my pack and went. The trail up drainage was narrow and rooted and in full shadow by mid-morning, the hemlock canopy closing the corridor to a dim green-gray light that flattened distance and made it hard to judge how far sound was traveling. I moved carefully. I kept my breathing even, and through my nose. I did not hum. I did not whistle. I counted steps when I needed something to focus on, because counting is not melodic, and numbers, in sequence, do not constitute a phrase. I found the rock the hiker had described a large, flat-topped quartzite outcrop where the creek bent north, the kind of rock that a person might naturally sit on if they wanted to rest or think. It sat at the edge of the water, with its surface slightly above the creek's current level, dry and gray in the diffuse morning light. No one was there. I documented the site the way I was trained to document sites where something might have happened. Photographs first, then close observation without touching, then written notes. The moss on the upstream face of the rock had been compressed into a clear impression, a seated shape, the flattened outline of a person who had sat in one position long enough for the vegetation to register the weight. I estimated the duration at several hours minimum, based on the depth of compression and the way the moss had begun to dry at the edges of the impression, as if whatever had sat there had been gone long enough for the moisture to start equalizing. I looked at the shape for a long time. The shoulder width was narrow, not outside human range, but at the low end of it, narrower than the hip width, which is unusual in adult proportions. The femoral impression, the length of thigh contact with the rock surface, was longer than the shoulder width suggested it should be. Not impossible, not definitively wrong, just slightly off in a way that I could not stop looking at. I took 6 photographs. I wrote my notes. I started back toward the station. 40 minutes of daylight left in the corridor. I moved quickly. Behind me, someone began whistling the check-in signal. 2 short notes, 1 long. The standard NPS field check-in pattern, the signal that means, I am here. I am your partner. Confirm you receive me. The pattern every ranger learns in their first week of field training. The pattern that, when you hear it behind you on a trail, every instinct in your body tells you to answer. I did not answer. I turned slowly, one hand on the radio on my hip, not to use it, but to have something solid to hold. The turn took about 3 seconds. I needed it to feel controlled. I needed my body to believe it was controlled, even though my chest had tightened to the point where my breathing had gone shallow, and my vision had sharpened in that particular way that happens when the body decides something in the immediate environment is a threat. A figure stood at the first trail bend, approximately 60 yards behind me. Ranger-sized, the right height, the right build for a person who worked outdoors. The clothing was the right color, the muted olive and gray tones that NPS field staff wear in shoulder season. The figure was not moving toward me. It was whistling the check-in signal again. Rule 5. Do not whistle in response until you have visually confirmed that person is human and facing toward you. The figure was not facing me. It was facing away, toward the upper drainage, its back to me, whistling the check-in pattern in my direction, while facing the wrong way, the way a sound is thrown rather than made, the way a ventriloquist produces something that appears to come from a location other than its source. I counted. 1 minute. 2. The figure did not turn. The check-in pattern repeated at irregular intervals. My thumb rested against the radio's transmit button, and I did not press it. At minute 9, it turned. The face was present. I want to be precise about this. There was a face, with the correct components in the correct positions. Eyes, nose, mouth, the general architecture of a human face. But the expression was neutral, in a way that faces are not neutral. Faces at rest still carry intention, the residue of recent emotion, the anticipation of the next one. This face had neither. It was a face that understood the inventory of what a face required, without understanding the reason any of it existed. I backed away, slowly. No sudden movement. No sound. I backed the entire half-mile to the station door without turning around. I locked the station door. That's the first thing I did through the deadbolt on a door I hadn't bothered to lock once since arriving, and then stood with my back against it and waited for my breathing to normalize. The station was warm and lit and smelled like wood smoke and old paper and the residual mineral smell from my damp boots. And I cataloged all of that deliberately, because specificity was the only tool I had. Inez was at the table. She looked at me when I came in, and she looked at my face, and she didn't ask what I'd seen. She just nodded and turned back to her work. I pulled the oldest maintenance log from the shelf. Not the current binder, the one at the far left of the shelf row, the one with the worn spine and the faded date range on the label. 2009 to 2013. The early entries were routine. Maintenance logs always are serial numbers, condition ratings, trail surface assessments, the quiet institutional accumulation of data that nobody reads unless something goes wrong. I turned pages. I read names. I tracked the rotation of rangers through the station over 4 years. In November of 2011, the entries became different. Not dramatically. The data was still there, the water readings, the trail reports, the inventory counts. But the language stripped down. The descriptive phrases disappeared. Everything became shorter, more procedural, as if the ranger writing the entries had decided that observation was a luxury they could no longer afford. Then, on December 4th of 2011, a ranger named Darby Oakes wrote a single entry that was not a routine entry. It was 3 words and a number. Melody, debt, incomplete. 3 days. That was all. The next entry in the log was in different handwriting. A different ranger's name at the top of the page. A routine water monitoring record, dated 1 week later. Darby Oakes did not appear again anywhere in the log. I closed the binder. I put it back on the shelf. I pulled the next binder, and then the next, checking the name columns. And he was not in any of them. I went back to the 2011 binder. I opened it to the back cover and felt along the inside edge of the rear pocket. The accordion fold sleeve that maintenance binders use for loose documents that don't fit the standard form. There was something in there. Folded, small, yellow paper, the kind that comes from a legal pad. I unfolded it on the table. Darby Oakes's handwriting. The same clean, upright script from the log entries, but compressed here, working against the limited space of the page, getting smaller toward the bottom, as if he'd run the calculations on how much room he had and was trying to make it last. He described getting caught mid-phrase at dusk. He didn't say what the phrase was. He said he had been humming while he worked and lost track of time, and the sun was further down than he'd realized. And then he heard the response and understood what had happened. He wrote, "It doesn't let you finish. Every time I reach the resolution, it adds a measure. I have to follow it, or I stop in the middle. And if I stop in the middle, it finishes for me. I've seen what it looks like when it finishes for someone. I'm not going to write that down." He'd been running the melodic obligation for 4 hours when he wrote those words. Toward the bottom of the page, in notation that had gotten shakier, he had written out a musical phrase in standard notation, treble clef, 4 measures. A simple ascending modal line that resolved awkwardly on the 4th bar, like something that had been extended past its natural end and couldn't quite find a new home. The phrase he had apparently still been following. I stared at that notation for a long time. I folded the page and put it back in the binder pocket. I looked at Inez. She was watching me from the table. "Now you know what I know," she said. I said, "What happened to your last partner?" She said, "He started a melody at 6:58 and thought 2 minutes was enough margin." That was all she said. That was enough. Night 6 was when I understood that whatever was in the hemlock corridor had been doing something I hadn't named, yet something more methodical than hunting, more patient than waiting. It had been listening, not just on the nights when I made sounds it could respond to, but continuously, building something I can only describe as a profile, a map of my specific acoustic habits, the particular melodic tendencies that are as individual as handwriting. I realized this because of the response interval. On the first night I'd heard it, the response had come approximately 40 seconds after the provocating sound. On the trail, when I hummed the folk fragment, the 3-note answer had come after what I estimated at 20 to 30 seconds. On night 4, when the thing outside completed my exhaled phrase, the response had been almost immediate, under 10 seconds. It was getting faster. Not because it was getting closer, though it may have been that too. It was getting faster because it no longer needed to process the input. It had accumulated enough data about my specific interval preferences, my particular way of landing on certain pitches, the slight upward resolution I tend to apply to the end of phrases, that it could predict my next note before I produced it. The processing delay was disappearing because anticipation had replaced it. It knew my melodic signature. Inez was functionally silent by that point. She moved through the station routines with mechanical accuracy. She ate, she completed her forms, she maintained the station's operational requirements with the focused competence of someone who had reduced their internal experience to the minimum necessary to keep functioning. But she had not spoken voluntarily since naming the melody on night 5, and she did not speak voluntarily now. I was, in every operational sense that mattered, running this station alone. I sat at the table that night with my hands flat on the wood surface, and I listened to the entity listened to me. I could feel it, the way you feel, being watched in a dark room, not through any specific sense, but through the composite of all of them, the body's aggregate reading of the environment, arriving at a conclusion that the rational mind is still formatting. It knew me, the specific acoustic shape of me. I had no idea yet what it planned to do with that. On the evening of day 7, at 6:31 p.m., Inez left, not with her pack, not with the radio. She opened the station door and walked out toward the trail junction, and she didn't look back, and she didn't say anything. And by the time I reached the door to call after her, she was already at the edge of the hemlock tree line, and the light was going fast. And I knew with a certainty that I have never been able to explain rationally that calling her name, making the sound of her name in that specific direction, toward those trees, in the direction she had walked, would be the worst thing I could do. I filed a welfare report via radio, per protocol. I kept my voice completely flat. No inflection, no tonal variation, pure information. Ranger name, last known location, time of unwitnessed departure, relevant protocol invoked. I sounded, I imagine, like someone reading a form rather than describing a colleague walking into the dark. That was intentional. That was Rule 6, saving me from something I couldn't afford to feel in that moment. From the hemlock line, very faintly, I heard what might have been Inez's voice, singing, quietly, the old mountain song she had named on night 5. I did not approach the window. I took a piece of paper from the supply shelf and wrote my name on it, Callum Reese, in clear block letters. And I placed it face down on the floor beside the door. Rule 7, said my own voice. It said nothing about someone else's. But the principle underneath the rule felt applicable in a way I couldn't fully articulate. And in the absence of complete information, I chose to err toward the architecture of the rules rather than their literal text. Then I sat down in the middle of the station floor, equidistant from all 4 walls, and I thought very carefully about the next 3 nights, and what following every rule simultaneously would actually require of me. I knew, sitting there, that I was going to find out. Night 8 began at sundown, and I was ready for it, in the way that you are never actually ready for it. All the preparation done, all the protocols memorized, all the understanding in place, and underneath all of it, the bone-level knowledge that understanding something and being able to endure it are not the same category of capability. At 7:12 p.m., the creek went silent. I set the timer. I folded my hands. I breathed through my nose in the flattest, most atonal pattern I could produce. The station was quiet and warm and very small. At 7:19, a melody came from beyond the east wall. It moved slowly, the notes spaced with that same deliberate interval, not fast enough to be a song, not random enough to be wind. It was almost a melody I knew. It was aimed at the part of my brain that recognizes musical patterns and categorizes them automatically. The way the eye categorizes shapes, the way the ear sorts speech from noise. My musician's cortex was working on it before I could stop it. I felt the recognition forming, the same way you feel a word arriving before you've said it. I will not name it here. I won't name it in any document I produce. I understand now what naming does. At minute 11 of the creek silence, the radio emitted the NPS check-in pattern. 2 short, 1 long, clear as a training recording. I did not respond. I held 4 protocols simultaneously. Creek silence, melody non-recognition, radio non-response, flat effect maintenance. I sat on the station floor, and I ran all 4 of them, like a person running parallel machinery, monitoring each one for slippage, correcting as I went. The entity was cycling through its learned repertoire. I understood that clearly. It had studied the rules long enough to know what each one demanded of me, and it was running them in combination to find the intersection where compliance with one required violation of another, the precise configuration of pressure that would cause a human being following 6 rules at once to drop one of them. It was not guessing randomly. It was running a systematic probe. My timer reached 15 minutes. The creek did not return. It stayed silent. The melody continued from the east wall. The radio repeated the check-in pattern. And then, from somewhere much closer than the hemlock line, from somewhere that might have been just outside the station's east-facing window, something began playing a melody I had not heard in 14 months. A melody I had heard every day for 6 years in a classroom. A melody that a boy named Marcus Ellard used to hum while he worked. I knew the melody completely. That's the thing about a sound you've heard daily for years from someone you cared about. It doesn't live in your memory the way other sounds live there. It lives in the body. It was in my hands, in my chest, in the specific posture I'd had sitting at my classroom desk, watching him work. 4 measures, simple, modal, slightly off the standard scale, in a way that was entirely his own. A fragment of something older, something he'd probably heard once and internalized without knowing its origin. His melodic fingerprint. Nobody outside that classroom had ever heard it. It was not a famous tune. It was not from any recording. It existed in 2 places, wherever Marcus Ellard was now, and somewhere in the tissue of my auditory memory that I could not access without the grief coming with it. The entity was playing it from 4 feet outside my window. I understood, in that moment, what the entity was. Not what it looked like. I still don't know that, and I don't want to. I understood what it was functionally. It was not a predator that hunted by proximity. It was a system that accumulated acoustic data sounds, patterns, emotional signatures encoded in melodic choice, and it had been accumulating mine since before I arrived. From the logs I'd handled, from the notation I'd read, from every exhalation and unconscious hum I'd produced in 4 days of thinking I was alone, when I was always, without interruption, being heard. It had found Marcus in me. My throat closed. The impulse to complete that melody, to give it the resolution it had never gotten because its owner was 12 years old and gone before he could finish anything, was the most powerful single impulse I have ever experienced. Every grief reflex, every guilt response, every accumulated weight of the last 14 months compressed into the physical urge to open my mouth and finish the phrase. I took the paper with my name on it, and I pressed my palm flat against it on the floor. I felt the texture of the paper under my hand. I felt the hardwood under the paper. I focused on the specific physical reality of cold wood and thin paper, and the pressure of my own weight through my palm until the material world was more real than the melody. The 4 measures repeated outside the window. I held. I held because stopping meant it would finish for me. And Darby Oakes, who had been a ranger and a person, and whose handwriting I had held in my hands, had told me in his own compressed and terrified script that he would not write down what that looked like. I believed him. The melody shifted. The 4 measures of Marcus's phrase faded, not cut off, not interrupted, but gradually replaced the way one instrument hands off a line to another. What replaced it was a whistle. My whistle. I know this requires explanation, so I'll give it precisely. Every person who whistles has a tonal signature, as specific as their speaking voice, a characteristic timbre produced by the particular geometry of their lips and teeth and airway, a set of default interval choices that express themselves as reliably as handwriting. I know this because I taught music for 6 years, and I trained my ear to hear it. I know my own signature the way I know my own handwriting. What was outside the window was my whistle, not an approximation, not a close analog. The actual acoustic product of my specific instrument, played from outside my own body. It was playing the notation from Darby Oakes's page. The 4 measures he'd written out in his increasingly shaky hand, the ascending modal line that couldn't find a resolution. It was playing those 4 measures in my voice, in my timbre, with my interval preferences, from outside the window of the station, where I was sitting on the floor, with my hand on a piece of paper, with my name on it. The entity had collected that notation from the paper I handled, reading it, turning it over in my hands, running my eyes over those measures that had been enough. It had everything it needed. I wrote my name again. Second sheet. Pressed that one down, too. Both palms, both pages, flat on the floor on either side of me. I did not approach the window. I did not answer. I sat with my own voice playing outside, and I stayed on the floor, and I stayed as silent as the creek. At 11:47 p.m., the whistling stopped. At 11:49, the creek came back. I did not move until morning. I sat on that floor in the cooling station with my palms on 2 pieces of paper, and I watched the dark window, and the dark window gave me nothing back. And at some point, the gray began at the edges of the glass, and I understood that the night was over, and I was still inside it, and still me, I think. I was reasonably sure. In the flat gray of early morning, with the creek running, and the wood stove cold, and the station full of the particular silence that follows something that has no name, I sat at the table, and I thought about the laminated card. 7 rules. No form number. No issuing authority. No date. I had been thinking about them as procedures, as the kind of institutional protocols that accumulate in remote stations the way sediment accumulates, layer by layer, without any single person being responsible for the total. I had been treating them the way you treat rules you don't understand but choose to follow, as given facts, as inherited guidance, as someone else's prior knowledge crystallized into imperative. But in the morning light, with 4 nights of data behind me, and Darby Oakes's notation still folded in the binder, and my own voice still active in my auditory memory, from the night before, I read them differently. They were not procedures. They were a behavioral profile. Every rule described something the entity did, the mechanism it used, the trigger it responded to, the specific action that would complete or interrupt its hunting sequence. The 7 p.m. threshold was not a rule the entity followed. It was the threshold at which the entity's acoustic sensitivity sharpened enough to detect submelodic signals, the precise point at which the drainage corridor's temperature inversion altered the sound channeling properties of the air, and made it possible for something to locate a target by the sound of their breath alone. Someone had survived long enough to reverse engineer all of that. Probably more than one person, because no single incident produces 7 specific rules. 7 specific rules require 7 separate discoveries, 7 separate encounters. Each one survived by exactly the margin required to record the observation, and nothing more. The laminated card was not a safety notice. It was a field guide compiled from the specific experiences of specific people who had mostly not made it back. And someone with a laminator and a printer and the institutional authority to have it taped to the inside of a ranger station door had decided this was an adequate response. I searched the station's administrative files. The gray accordion binder on the bottom shelf that holds budget paperwork and district correspondence, and the kind of official communication that gets filed and never read again. 40 minutes of searching. 1 page. an internal memo dated March of 2014 on District Resource Management letterhead. Short. 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph referenced a resource inventory initiative across remote backcountry stations. The second paragraph contained a single sentence about Kephart Prong. This corridor has been designated a sensitive acoustic environment under ongoing district monitoring and is subject to modified operational protocols. The third paragraph outlined staffing recommendations: 2-person rotations, shoulder season only, maximum 30-day assignments. No explanation of what sensitive acoustic environment meant. No definition of modified operational protocols. No reference to the laminated card or its contents or its origin. No reference to any of the rangers who had passed through this station and failed to complete their rotation. The memo was signed by a name I didn't recognize, a district-level administrator I'd never heard of. Below the signature, in the bottom left corner where form numbers and file designations go, was a 3-letter code I didn't recognize either. Not a standard NPS classification code. Nothing that appeared in any of the administrative manuals I'd been trained on. Someone knew what Kephart Prong was. Someone had assessed it, classified it, assigned it a code, written a memo about it, and then continued to send 2-person rotating seasonal crews into it with a laminated card on the inside of the door as the sum total of their preparation. I put the memo back between the trail maintenance budgets where I'd found it. I sat at the table. I thought about the next rotation, the next 2 rangers who would receive this posting and arrive in October and see the card and ask Inez or whoever came after Inez what it meant. I called for extraction on the morning of day 9. I radioed Okanalufte dispatch and reported the end of my rotation period. I kept my voice completely flat. I reported Inez Varga's unwitnessed departure as a welfare event with no confirmed cause, pending follow-up by the district office. I reported the hiker sighting from day 6 as an unverified recreational contact, insufficient detail for formal documentation. I reported 0 trail incidents and normal water monitoring results across all gauge stations. Everything I wrote in the official log was factually accurate as far as it went. I had not seen Inez after she walked into the tree line. I had not been able to confirm the identity of the person the hiker saw in the creek bed. The water readings were normal. What I did not write, the completed melody from the hemlock line, the creek silences, the figure at the trail bend that could not turn around on command, Darby Oakes's page, the notation, the specific melody of a 12-year-old boy played in my own voice from outside a window at 11:30 p.m. I left the laminated card on the inside of the door, exactly where I found it, exactly as I found it. I left the yellow legal paper in the binder pocket. I left the memo in the administrative file. I left everything as I found it. And as I walked out the door and up the trail with my pack and my field notebook and the weight of what I now knew, I understood exactly what I was doing. I was doing what Inez had done, what every ranger who survived this posting had done. I was leaving the infrastructure intact for the next one, because the alternative was something I lacked the authority and the vocabulary to do. I told myself that. I'm still telling myself that. I took a desk assignment in Asheville. Permit processing, trail budget reviews, the administrative work of a park system that has far more of it than it has people willing to do it. I am good at it. It requires attention to detail and a tolerance for repetitive process and the ability to sit in a quiet room for extended periods and work steadily without needing the work to be meaningful. I have all of those things now. I cannot hear music without analyzing it. That's the most accurate way I can describe what Kephart Prong cost me practically in daily function. I can't listen to a song without my brain involuntarily mapping its melodic structure. The interval choices, the phrase lengths, the resolution tendencies. I cannot sit in a restaurant or a waiting room or a grocery store with music playing without monitoring my own sub-vocalizations for tonal drift. I cannot speak in a conversation without tracking the melodic quality of my own voice, the inflection patterns, the places where natural speech shades into something with a shape. I have not been back to the Smokies. I've declined 2 subsequent postings to Western North Carolina districts. The rejection forms ask for a reason. I've written personal preference on both of them, which is technically accurate in the same way that all of my official documentation from Kephart Prong was technically accurate. I do not whistle. I have not whistled in 14 months, and the absence of it, the daily management of a reflex that used to be as natural as breathing, has become its own kind of constant background task. A thing I do without deciding to. A maintenance requirement with no end date and no formal closure procedure. Some assignments don't end when you leave. This one followed me home. Last week, I was at my desk in the Asheville administrative office. Tuesday afternoon, mid-October, the same time of year, I arrived at Kephart Prong 14 months ago. I was processing backcountry permit applications for the following season. Routine work. The office was warm and fluorescent lit and smelled like printer toner and the burnt bottom coffee that has been sitting on the warming plate since morning. I caught myself doing it. A melodic exhale. 3 or 4 seconds of shaped breath. Not a whistle, not a hum, but the thing between them that Rule 1 specifically names and prohibits. It had been building without my awareness the way it always builds, the reflex predating the conscious mind's involvement. I stopped immediately. I sat completely still. The office HVAC system ran at its normal frequency. The printer across the room cycled through a job. Somewhere down the hall, someone's phone rang twice and went to voicemail. All of it was normal. All of it was exactly what it should be. Nothing answered. I waited 10 minutes. I logged the incident in a personal notebook I keep in my desk drawer. Not an official form. Nothing that would enter the NPS record system. Just a small spiral notebook where I write the dates and times and durations of any tonal vocalization, accidental or otherwise. 14 months of entries. The intervals between them have been getting shorter. I don't know if that means the reflex is reasserting itself, or if it means something else. I don't know if the thing in the Kephart Prong drainage is location dependent, or if it accumulates a signature and follows it. I don't know if silence in an office in Asheville is the same as silence in a hemlock corridor at 7 p.m. I'm still listening for an answer. I'm hoping I don't get one.